Hello, my fellow Americans. Welcome to the Religious Nut and Hellbound Sitter podcast. We have the best podcast in America. Not kidding. And I am the greatest Hellbound Sitter on the planet. I am more Hellbound than anybody. And here is my fantastic colleague.
I'm the Religious Nut. Brother James?
He is more nutty than any other religious nut ever. Don't listen to the fake news, people.
Sure, we'll go with that.
Had to make my little nod to our favorite orange president.
Oh, yes. He's so orange.
Yes.
Love fake tans. They're better than fake news, definitely.
So, how are you, Kingy?
I'm doing well. We are right now in the season of Lent at church. So that's the fun part that we're doing right now.
So fasting is fun?
Oh yeah, totally fun. No, it's part of the whole liturgical calendar. So for people who don't know what Lent is a 40-day fast right before Easter, and during Lent the traditions vary. So for me, what we do is we abstain from red meat and lessen our chicken and dairy products and stuff like that. And then we usually give up one thing for Lent and then add another thing as a Lenten discipline. So I gave up video games because I play video games a lot and I love it. And I replaced it with more reading. The whole reason for it is to sort of try to recall to mind through it the idea that our only necessity is Christ himself.
Oh. So, since we've talked about Peter Rollins before, and he's becoming quite a popular phenomenon, would you ever consider going through the type of fast that he likes to do through Lent, where it's atheism for Lent?
I would not. The faith is way too ingrained in me, and a sort of sacramental approach to Christianity I think is way too beneficial for me. I would see no advantage in getting rid of that for 40 days. Part of it, it seems like he's trying to get people to get outside of their Christian bubble, and I don't really think I have a Christian bubble.
You don't have a bubble.
Nope, no bubble.
No bubble.
I read atheists. I read various atheists, non-Christian.
Oh my gosh! So I have not watched anything from Richard Dawkins in forever, and I saw something posted today where it was a clip from one of his talks with another scientist, and one of the questions from the audience. Again, I don't know if he ever really gets any or many good questions at some of these places, so when he does his bitch slap, it's kind of deserved, I'm gonna have to say, if he's going up against some fundamentalist rhetoric. But it was kind of funny, because the question was, you like to say, Dawkins, that it's good to have evidence for what you believe in. What's your evidence that that's true?
Wow.
Right? And so Dawkins said, wait, so you're asking me how we know science works. So planes fly, rockets go to the moon, you don't die from polio, it works,
Yeah.
It's like, honestly, I suppose because of fundamentalism, we need a person like Richard Dawkins, but, this is why we have this show.
Yeah. I cannot stand Richard Dawkins, but I would probably give him a standing ovation for that.
Right?
That is... Okay, fellow Christians, that's not a smart question to ask, okay? Just to let you know. I don't want to comment too much on atheism for Lent, but I don't have a reason to.
Okay, the ironic thing about this is you're the one who introduced me to Rollins, and I think I know now more about him than you do. So.
Oh yeah, I'm sure you do, yeah. But hey, I don't think I've ever mentioned before, I have actually met him and had a beer with him.
You told me that! I'm jealous.
Yeah. So, okay, I gotta tell the story now.
Go for it, please.
Alright, so a friend of mine, she, for a time was sort of in the whole, I'm agnostic, but I really love the Christian faith and all that kind of thing. She was looking at orthodoxy. So she introduced me to Peter Rollins, and so I started watching some videos, like, oh, he's cool, I like some of this stuff. Some of the stuff, nah. So then, she lives in Memphis, so she's like, she texts me one day, she's like, Peter Rollins is going to be in Nashville tomorrow. I'm like, oh, okay. And she's like, I'm going to be there. And he has these all-day sessions, during that day. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't make it for the morning ones. And I was going to try to make it for an evening one, but some stuff happened. So I ended up like getting really, really late, but I made it in time for his, not for his sessions, but for this thing he did at like a coffee shop afterwards.
Oh.
So I made it in time for that whole thing. And I asked him a question during the Q&A part where about some of the stuff. I don't remember what the question was. So he answered and all that stuff. So then afterwards, I went up to him and shook his hand. And there was, I want to say about 50 or 60 people there.
Yeah.
He tells me in his awesome Irish accent. I'm not even trying to...
I'm in love with Irish accents, just going to say.
Yes, they are, yes. He tells me, I just want to thank you because during my talk, the entire time you were engaged in the conversation. You weren't kind of just lying back and looking at your cell phone. You kept eye contact and all that stuff. I'm like, oh. He goes, would you like to have a beer? I'm like, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and now it wasn't just me and him, but
yeah.
It was like probably about anywhere between half a dozen and a dozen people. And my friend Marissa was there with me because I got to drag her along. And so she's like, oh, thank you so much and stuff. And so that was really cool.
Damn, yeah.
But yeah, so that's my story.
Yeah, I don't think I'd heard that full version of it, so that's great. Yeah. I seriously would love to have a chat with him. He is...
Well, you know what? I remember listening to one of his talks on Facebook once, and he was like, you guys think that we philosophers are like so busy and stuff like that. We are sitting around on our computers all day. If you email us, we will email back.
Oh, hell. I have to do this now. I mean,
wait till the
seriously,
recording's over.
I've noticed most of his YouTube videos are Facebook Live from his bed.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I keep telling him he needs to come to Nashville again, and he's like, yeah, well, we want to, kind of thing,
All right.
He actually, he did this thing about wanting to do a C.S. Lewis thing in Belfast, and I expressed it. He set up Eventbrites or whatever that thing is called. So I put that in as an expressing interest. He's trying to see how much interest there is, and then he's going to give more information on, depending on what. Yeah. So I'd very much be interested in seeing that. Anyway, so how are you doing?
I'm great. So I've had a fun weekend. Totally redoing my hair. We have bleached a couple times this weekend, and after this podcast tonight, I am going to color it titanium silver with a little bit of shark blue. So it's going to look phenomenal.
Nice.
Yeah.
You are going to have to post pictures on our Facebook page. We have a Facebook page, by the way.
Oh, yes. Please go like our Facebook page if you haven't yet.
The name is Religious Nut and Hellbound Center Podcast.
We are more nutty and hellbound than anybody else. I'm telling the truth. Yes. And in other news, I got engaged last weekend. Woo!
Oh! So when's the date?
Oh, we don't have an exact date yet. We're hoping on some sort of summer wedding because we want to have a big party outside. So if it doesn't work out this summer, it'll be next summer, but hopefully it'll be this summer. Fingers crossed. It's pretty awesome.
Oh, cool. I was going to...
What?
I was going to make it... Never mind.
Oh my god, now I'm going to be wondering what you're talking about.
No. I didn't want to put you on the spot with it. Actually, okay, it doesn't matter anyway, because I wouldn't be able to do it. I was going to be like, may I preside over it? But
oh, well, I mean, are you ordained yet? I mean, you can always do that.
I wouldn't be ordained. Yeah. and that plus,
hey, you're totally welcome to come to the wedding. That'd be awesome. But yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I definitely would love to go, but I wouldn't be able to, even if I were ordained, theological reasons. But
whatever.
No, sorry, because you're a Hellbound sinner. So
I'm just gonna give you the bitch face.
I'm not gonna bless your satanic union. I'm just kidding.
My union is more satanic than anyone else's. I don't care what the fake news tells you.
You kind of went between spearmint and
I Trump know. I mean, because like when I do the Trump, I kind of pull the Alec Baldwin on SNL, and that's kind of like my spearmint,
I think you should just do a spearmint Trump.
I could try doing that, We'll
Anyway,
have to try that later, yes.
We have really, we've talked a lot. We haven't even gotten to the meat of the episode.
We gotta get into this episode.
Okay, so what are we talking about, King? We're talking about psychology and psychotherapy and Freud and your mom and everything like that.
All that good stuff.
Yes, that's what we're doing. And I'm going to ask you questions about it. All right, so
question
number
one. I'm so
one.
scared of your questions. Why are you questioning me? Jeez.
Can we just love each other? Anyway, so
Kumbaya, my lord.
I hate that song. Please, dear God. Anyway, so we're going to talk about psychology and psychotherapy specifically, and how it relates with, how it deals with the questions of evil and suffering and such like that, and just sort of how Chris approaches the topic, because I would hazard a guess that there are various ways in psychology and psychotherapy that suffering and evil can be addressed, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one I want to go up with is, has a bit to do with it, but it's on probably at least 40% of everyone's minds. What the Scrooge is up with Freud and moms and sex and all that stuff? Like, what is up with him?
I could say a million things about that, and we don't have time for it in this podcast. However, I'll do the best I can.
All right.
I will say, this is similar to what, I believe I said this briefly in my Mini-Me episode formerly. The vast majority of theories in psychology come from a combination of the one making the theories and their own experiences with their own past and the clients that they work with. So, okay. I mean, honestly, Freud published so much, and there's been a lot of people trying to psychoanalyze Freud. But honestly, as I said again in the Mini-Me episode, there are a lot of psychoanalysts out there who are very similar to a lot of ideas in Freud, but they've expanded on it. So really, in psychoanalysis, as a whole, it's a more intensive form of therapy where you're going usually 3 to 4 times a week for several years in order to really understand the whole person. And there's a lot that is looked at in the person specifically in terms of what they think about their analyst or their therapist and all the feelings that they can project in the therapy room. And that's where a lot of the deep work is done, because it can be seen right there as opposed to being referred to in the third person. And honestly, there's really, when we have the adult mind with the boundaries we put in place over relationships, we tend to think, okay, this is a friendship, this is a romantic relationship, but when you get down underneath all of it, our deepest emotions and our youngest emotions don't really understand those boundaries. So in general, that's kind of the way that, with me borderlining on being very basic in my description here, that's kind of a psychoanalytic way of answering your question. That's nowhere near the breadth of the scope of what psychoanalysis can offer. But if you're going to talk specifically about Freud, he was kind of, the way we understand him now is he was bridging hard scientific medical knowledge and what we now understand that's come from that. And so his theory was basically formed on the idea of basic drives for the purpose of propagating the species. And in terms of his major theory, that he had basically 3 stages of his formulations of his theory, and he ended with conflict theory, and it was based in drives and the libido, and
so that's where the sexual drive for your mother comes from, and
exactly. I mean,
that's why you find a hatred for your dad and stuff, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, if you're gonna take him in his most classical sense, he used the metaphor of Oedipus back from Greek mythology, where it was kill your father, get with your mother, kind of idea. And honestly, I think to fully develop what those things can really mean for being human, that I really do stand by, is that everybody, from the time we're born, we're whole beings. And that includes sexuality, it includes sensuality, the touch, the connection between you and your parent. So everything is there. Freud tended to hyper-focus on humans more as a mechanism or as a subset of drives. And a lot of psychoanalysts now would view his understanding as limited. So, I mean, I gave a very scholarly answer to your very sexualized question. And this reminds me, and I'm going to say this here because it was a lot of fun. This was back in 2013 when I was in grad school, when we were taking our psychological theories class, and me and a colleague in that class teamed up to do a presentation on psychoanalysis, Freud, and the others that followed. And we special ordered these t-shirts just for that presentation. And her t-shirt was the classic picture of Freud with the cigar, and he had a thought bubble saying, "Your mom." And my t-shirt had this side profile picture of Freud's head with a receding hairline, and across his forehead was a nude woman, and the caption under it read, "What's on every man's mind?" So,
good grief. So I had another question if I could add to the whole Freud thing. I see in my very limited non-professional, sort of understanding of psychoanalysis. We've talked about this a few years ago.
Don't listen to Brother James. He does not have professionalism at all. My professionalism is the best, believe me.
So I think one of the dangers I see, and maybe it's kind of overhyped by media and the movies and all that, is that I see the danger in psychoanalysis is that the psychologist or psychotherapist or whoever might be projecting their own positions and thoughts sort of into the person, the patient's psyche or do you understand what I'm getting at?
I am so glad you brought that up, and I would love to talk about that. Yeah. That is honestly one of the biggest concerns in our field. And I would say, to be honest, at least, okay, this is coming from my experience in the last couple years in the field as it is now. Mm-hmm. But major value in our field, whether we're outside of psychoanalysis or within psychoanalysis, is very much on understanding, cast the outside of psychoanalysis to the side for a minute, dealing deep within psychoanalysis, and specifically, I don't know if I've said this on this podcast before, but I've been taking a class this year specifically on psychoanalysis, and I've talked with analysts who operate very classically, like from Freud's paradigm. And there have been times in class they've been reading a case example from a patient, and in there, some of us are speculating on our theories of what's working with the patient there, and the analysts who are the teachers in our class will say, "That's a great idea, but in session, we're wanting their associations, not ours." So what I've understood from psychoanalysis now is the focus is on getting the patient's associations with what's going on with them internally, and being very careful so that we don't force ours on them. At the same time, realizing that we have two people in this session, and we have very fancy terms. One's transference, one's countertransference. Transference is basically anything that the patient in session feels about us that might not really be about us. And countertransference would be vice versa. I have this idea about the patient that really is not about them. And so that's why getting seriously, every analyst worth their soap right now meets regularly with a consultant, gets some feedback on how best to help their patients, and gets their own analysis and their own therapy to deal with that stuff and what's going on inside of them to avoid projecting that onto the patient. So I would say what I know of psychoanalysis is it's very careful about that stuff, and a lot of the concerns about the analyst forcing that stuff onto the patient, honestly, that does happen. And like I said in my Mini-Me episode, there's a lot of people in this field that shouldn't be there and are not getting the proper consultation. But I would think the way that analysis is performed in the media or portrayed popularly is really a misunderstanding or misapplication.
Okay. But it's had that before, you would say, right?
Yeah. I mean, like any field, we've evolved a lot. And like I said in the Mini-Me episode, yes, we used to be a very fundamentalist field where it had to be this way in understanding people, and you really forced your theory onto the patient. And now what I hear talked about, whether you're a classical analyst, object relations, or a more modern or postmodern type of analyst, the focus is much more on separating out your issues so they don't get in the way of the patient, and don't make the patient conform to your theory. Get to know the patient and then form the theory based on that.
Fundamentalists, so Sigmund Freud, 1611, and all that fun stuff.
Oh, yes. Freud, oh my gosh, he was a fundamentalist. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like I said in the last episode, he was f***ing brilliant, and he's one of my heroes. But yes, he was basically, if you don't see it my way, get the f*** out.
Wow. I've got to use a lot of beepers for this one.
I did it just for you.
Oh, thank you. Putting more work for me. Anyway.
That's what I do.
So, next question. So, what do you think psychotherapy has to offer to humanity?
Nothing at all. I don't know why we're doing this. Just kidding. Totally kidding. I mean, hey, the college that Brother James and I met at would say that. So. Okay. So my answer to that question, I'm going to have a few different points to make on that. First of all, I think I'll segue with the mini-me episode I made in that my way of approaching this is believing that psychotherapy offers a lot to people in helping them grow as a human being and helping them realize their full potential. This is regardless of whether or not they would be diagnosable with a mental illness or not, or whether they've experienced significant trauma or not. Now, nobody is created equal in my perspective, and some people have a lot more intense issues than other people do. But I really believe that psychotherapy has a lot to offer people wherever they are in their life. And I think one of the strengths of psychotherapy is most of us come to this work with the basic value that we're going to start by working within the worldview and the perspective of the client or the patient coming into our office. And there are going to be exceptions to this. I'll talk about this in a minute. But ultimately, and of course, because of this is like one of my strong values as a therapist too, is that it doesn't matter if this is our first time meeting or if we've been working together for a year. This person has lived with themselves their entire life. Mm-hmm. And I've known them as long as I've known them, 1 to however many times a week we've met. So there's a level to which they're the expert in their life and I'm not. Mm. And then there's another part of that, which is I have gotten a lot of training and I do have some expertise to be able to offer them, but at the same time, it's about hooking into what's within them that can make this work. And like I said, there are a few exceptions to this. One tends to be what I've gotten to know within the drug and alcohol counseling field, especially the therapists who are recovering addicts themselves, and specifically those who've gone through 12-step recovery programs. Excuse me. They tend to be a lot more rooted in, well, I recovered this way, so you need to as well, or something similar to that. Not necessarily that basic, but sometimes yes. Or I would say some forms of pastoral counseling, and I don't necessarily mean this in a bad way. Okay. There are a lot of churches that have begun to desire to hire counselors who've gone through their master's program and have a license in counseling to work as a counseling pastor in their church. And I think that's great. Okay. Actually, right now, one of my colleagues that I work with at the agency I'm employed at, she was a minister for about 20 or 30 years and then realized she wasn't really meeting as much of the needs of her parishioners as she would like to. And so she got her master's in counseling and works at our agency right now. And I've talked with her a few times on whether or not she'd like to go back into full-time ministry or work there or what she'd like to do. And we've had a lot of great conversations, and she sees, she's integrating a lot from these different perspectives, and she believes it's really enriching herself as both a minister and as a person and as a counselor. So, but at the same time, I think she would approach a lot of things differently than I would, in that sometimes when you're coming at things from a certain, again, I have my bias, and I can admit that. And that's one good thing about being a good counselor, is admitting where your bias is.
Yeah.
I think my main concern would be is the types of counselors that would say, no, this is just the way it is. I don't have a bias. You just need to do this. But there are plenty of counselors out there like that. But
well, I've told you before that two of my priests, I have 3 priests at my parish, 2 of them are professional counselors.
Yeah.
Which
that's
very
great.
helpful. I've been counseled by both of them, in fact, actually.
Yeah.
And the wife of one of the priests is as well. So
wow. Well, and specifically within the realm of one church, especially if they're part of that church and they have that background in counseling, that can really help out those training into the priesthood there, or the parishioners within their church, especially if they share a commonality in their value system or things like that. They don't have to worry about some of the things that cross our paths working in a place where we get people from all walks of life,
Yeah.
So, some people come to therapy with the idea that I'm going to come in here and this person is going to offer me stuff that I never thought about before, which... sideline, that part's true. You don't always see it right away. But the concept that a lot of people come to therapy with is they have some sort of a magic wand in the background that they're going to wave around and, oh my gosh, I'm going to see so much improvement right away. And you see that mostly with parents who bring their kids in and say, hey, fix this one, and really have no awareness of all of the dynamics in the family that are contributing to the problem in the first place. And really, what therapy can do is you have your own unique journey, just as everybody else does. And I'm joining with you as a person traveling along this road with you for a moment in time. I'll offer you a lot. A different perspective, the opportunity to gain a different perspective, certain questions I might ask, certain thoughts I might have, perspective that I can offer on, and this gets into so many people who do come to therapy are stuck in very self-aggrandizing places. And just being able to hear or be in a place with someone who, by their own being in session or body language or way of communicating, says to them, I accept you just as you are, and what you feel is important and valid. That in itself can have an incredibly healing effect. And I do see myself as a healer in a way. And I've been told by people that they feel like being in my presence has had a calming or healing effect on them. And that's something I take both as a gift from them and their appreciation of me, and as a humbling experience, because I honestly sometimes, and this is me sharing kind of vulnerably here, I can sometimes be unaware of how much effect I do have on people. And for somebody to be able to tell me I had that much of a positive influence in their life I'm very grateful for that. Yeah.
So we talked a little bit about problems and stuff like that. Do you see psychology sort of dealing with the problem of evil philosophically, or do you see it just kind of being more pragmatic and dealing with how do we lessen it kind of thing?
Right. I'm glad you asked the question. I would say that psychology itself doesn't really try to address the problem of evil or suffering from a grand scope, as we would say philosophy or religion does. And again, there are some limitations in the perspective I'll come from in this episode, because my experience and background is more so in the realm of psychotherapy and not so much in the research end or the scientific end of psychology. But again, there are always strengths and limitations in a Western scientific approach in the first place anyway. But my understanding mostly is that it's more of a pragmatic form of helping each person subjectively deal with the types of evils or suffering in their own personal life. And I have a few points to make about this, because there's some different ways of approaching it in our field. For anyone out there who's ever taken a Psych 101 class, one of the fundamental issues that's usually brought up in discussion is the concept of nature versus nurture. And honestly, if you want to see psychologists go at each other's throats, walk into any convention and yell that out, and you'll see it happen. But basically, is it more genetic, or is it more within ourselves, or is it more what happens to us in our life? And really, the best that the research can show, the best that clinical experience can show, if you look at it broadly, is yes.
Yeah, both.
It's both. But you'll find a lot of trauma-based therapies out there, and you'll find a lot of therapies out there that are addressing more internal problems. And really, it can depend on what the patient is able to do at the time. You know, there are some people that they can't really get into a lot of deep stuff depending on where they're at or limitations of whatever mental illness they might have at the time. But I will say probably the best way for me to describe the dichotomy in our field is, I don't know how many Star Trek nerds are watching our show, but if you've seen...
I'm not one.
I know, so I will have to educate you on this. Is the fifth movie, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier.
Oh, that one's so bad it's good.
Yes. My parents hated that one, and I love it. Not just because they hated it. Putting that out there. But
it's hilarious.
The overall plot of that is Vulcans in the Star Trek universe are all about transcending emotion and being rational, but in their deep past, they were the most emotional people on the planet, and they almost destroyed themselves. Well, in this film, there's a Vulcan who has embraced the emotional part of being Vulcan, and he's trying to hijack the Enterprise and take it on this quest to find God. I'm not going to get into the plot of this episode, but...
oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the whale one. This is not the whale one?
No.
Oh, okay.
The whale one is the fan favorite of everybody.
It's so horrible.
It is. Okay, I agree with that. I agree with it. But if you say that to any Star Trek nerd out there, they will beat your ass if you tell them it's bad.
Sorry. Yeah, so I know nothing about this one. I just thought we were talking about the one that was the whale one. So I don't know anything else. So proceed.
But basically, this movie is pretty philosophical, and it was actually written and directed by William Shatner himself, who played Kirk. But this Vulcan who's embraced his emotional side, his name is Sybok, who's actually a half-brother of Spock in this episode, in this movie. He has this internal gift that allows him to heal other people's pain from their past. But it's also very doubted and questioned and toyed with throughout the movie. He basically touches them and said, "Your pain runs deep, share it with me," and gain strength from the sharing. They share it with him through some energy, whatever, and release it, and all of a sudden, they're like, "Oh my God, you healed me. How did you get this power?" And he's like, "The power is within you," and all that. So, but they start following him. So after a while, Kirk starts thinking, "Dude, I think you're doing something here where you're going to be getting them to do whatever you want them to do." But at the end of the day, there's a very, very emotional scene between Sybok and Dr. McCoy with his dad's death, and afterwards, you know, it's the attention is turning to Captain Kirk, and McCoy says, "Dude, he took away my pain," and Kirk goes into one of his rare Kirk moments where you're like, "Oh my God, yeah." He says, "I don't need him to tell me that I have pain or to take it away. I know my pain. I need my pain. It's the things that we carry with us. It's the things that make us who we are. If we lose them, we lose ourselves." So I think that in a very dynamic way summarizes the fact that there are very different ways of approaching human suffering. And this comes out in therapy. And so I would say what I've observed as I've learned different forms of therapy is that there's some who take the Kirk side, some who take the Sybok side, some who find something in between. I wouldn't say some people go so far as to say, yes, we just need our pain and let it make us bitter, but rather, and I would say psychoanalysis and a few others kind of fit more into this side of things, where the goal is more gain awareness of what your inner conflicts and turmoils are, whether that was impacted by trauma or not. The goal of therapy there is to gain awareness of what's happened in your life, who you are and where you are now, and then help you move forward into what you can do with that. Sometimes the goal is more acceptance and harm reduction versus the other side, and this is more in terms of some trauma therapists I've talked to, people who are more into energy psychology, or mindfulness-based therapy. And I'll take a quick minute to say that a lot of mindfulness-based therapy is based on a lot of practices within Buddhism that one can transcend all forms of suffering and achieve a state of total positivity in their lives. And honestly, it makes me sick. And I get so tired of people saying, I'm just going to think positively and not think negatively. Okay, that's my bias. Yeah. I can totally own up to that. I can't stand it.
No, we agree there. So actually, real quick.
Yeah.
Something you said really caught me, and I wanted to ask you about that with your life in Christianity.
Yeah.
Did you grow up with an understanding of pain and suffering the Cybot way or the Kirk way?
I'm glad you asked me that question. Okay, first I'll start with that movie because my mom hated Cybok and loved Kirk in that movie.
Okay.
I would say that growing up, the concept of suffering or why does God allow it came up from time to time, but it wasn't really something in our family or in our churches that we would talk about very much. It was more, I would say the way that I was raised was more a form of denial, if I could put it that succinctly.
Okay.
If you're really feeling bad or if something really bad has happened to you, it's no big deal. You'll live. Okay. Kind of an idea. I mean, I don't remember if I've talked about this in the podcast before, but I was born in a small little town in southern Florida called Lake Wales. When I was not even 2, we moved to Sarasota, Florida. When I was about 2.5, we moved to Florhome, Florida. When I was 5,
I used to live right in Sarasota area.
I think you told me that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I was 5.5, we moved to Tennessee. When I was 6, we moved to Wisconsin. When I was 8, we moved to Pennsylvania. When I was 13, we moved to Missouri. And now I'm in Oklahoma. And honestly, that is something itself that I've had to work through a lot myself in my own therapy or in growing up as a person, because I've noticed many ways that moving around so much really affected my ability to be able to connect with people. And it wasn't just because we moved, but also kind of the philosophy that I was raised with was, it was both. It was, first of all, who cares that we're leaving these people here? We'll meet new people over here. The other part of that was very much an us versus the world kind of thing. We'll shield ourselves here and it doesn't matter who we come across. So more of a dissociated form of dealing with it. So I think, honestly, as I've gotten later into my 20s, I mean, I'm 30 now, but in my last few years, there's a lot of things I've actually had to look head on and address that I kind of breezed over earlier on in life. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm learning that it's very much a both kind of thing for suffering. Yeah. So how would you define spirituality, and how do you work that into your psychotherapy?
That's a great question. I have a few things to say about that. So first, I'd like to address what, at least from my perspective, spirituality is not. And when I use, again, I've kind of hinted at this before in previous podcasts, but my understanding of the term atheist for myself is very different from what some people would use when they use the term atheist. Not everyone. It's a very broad term and people come at it with all sorts of perspectives. There have been many people that have described my perspective on things as spiritual and others that don't think it is. And honestly, I try to work from how I understand myself, not how other people try to force something on me. I would say personally, I have a problem, and this is why in many contexts and with many people I would not use the term spiritual, is because when I use the term spiritual, I don't necessarily mean it to mean literal spirits that exist outside of
the physical realm.
Yes, and at the same time, that's a very facile way of understanding it, and there are other things I could say about that. But yes, I think at its core, I would say I have a problem with the idea of literal spirits. And at the same time, I would never say this to especially a patient or a client of mine who has very deep spiritual beliefs and is actually helping them get forward and get through the day. But yes, from my perspective, I would say I have a hard time saying that the literal spirits exist, and first and foremost, that a literal God exists outside of us. So that's what I would say, what I believe it's not. I'm careful about when I say I don't necessarily believe in literal spirits or God. There's a lot that can be meant when someone walks into a room and says, the spirit of this room feels like this, or the spirit of this person is still with me. My personality type, we can get into this at another time because I don't want to derail too much here, but there's a personality profile test called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It's one I had you take a little bit ago, Brother James, and actually you and I have the exact same personality type on that test, oddly enough. But for myself personally, whether it relates to that archetype or the fact that when the good Lord was handing out empathy, I stepped in line about 10 times, and between my intuition and my placing importance on what people are feeling, I do tend to see things that others don't. There's some ways that can be run with to the extreme to say that this therefore verifies Christianity. I don't think it does. Or the other extreme to say maybe it is all happening within me and not in between us. But I think it's my way of at the very least, reflecting on what's passing between us here in this moment. Or maybe a middle ground there is stuff passing between us, whether you call it energy, nonverbal cues. I think there is a lot about human relations or being human that's not really talked that much about in scientific literature or religious literature. Either way. And some are, but I think that's where my problem with reading some spiritual thinkers comes in, because the way some of them talk, the scientist in me is going to say, you're making a lot of grandiose claims here about the way things are that I don't know about. And then on the other side, looking at what I would see as very limiting ways of looking at the world, such as, well, can we verify that empirically? Okay, well, maybe given enough time, we'll be able to look at certain things that pass between us in different ways. But there's a lot to be said for intuition. What passes between humans on a nonverbal level that people experience differently. So I think that's why I have a hard time categorizing my experience as religious or spiritual, just because my way of experiencing it, and I've talked with other people who identify as empaths or other people who experience some things in the way that I do, but it's different and unique for them. So I would have a very hard time trying to force or say that the way that I experience these interactions or these elements of being human that science doesn't really speak on just yet, or psychology itself. Maybe within the therapeutic framework or in psychoanalysis, we talk about some things getting at that, but I think we have a long way to go. Honestly, I'm kind of like looking at this as theoretical physicists. Stephen Hawking might be about the origins of the universe or phenomena within the universe. I think psychology is in a very similar state right now. So I think there's a lot that can be talked about and published and discovered the more we grow in this field. I think some of my problems with forms of religion or spirituality is people who try to claim that they know it all and they're about to tell us what the spiritual realm is like. Or others that say, this is it and this is how everybody needs to see it, or this is how everybody needs to live by it. I would see it as much more of a subjective experience, which is why I'm also not going to tell the next person that their experience with God or spirits is irrelevant or inadequate. So what I believe it is, a lot of how I understand myself as a person or other people, and really I would say psychotherapy as a whole, and I'm careful about how I use this word and who I use it with. I would say psychotherapy as a whole is a spiritual exercise. I would say it's a very holistic way of approaching who a person is and connecting themselves more deeply with themselves. This is similar to what I said in my Mini-Me episode, is by getting to know yourself better and tapping into the core structure of who you are, which many people are unaware of. And I think, I didn't get to address this earlier, but I think one of the most significant gifts of psychoanalysis is the concept of the unconscious. The fact that much of who we are is out of our awareness. And that psychotherapy, especially from a psychoanalytic viewpoint, can help us get to know ourselves better. And the unconscious can tend to speak to us through dreams, through slips of the tongue, through certain behaviors or actions. And really, it's not a bad thing that we have an unconscious. I'm just going to say that. When we're dealing with people in psychotherapy or people who have some problems in their life, much of the conceptualization is that there's some breakdown in somewhere where there's an internal conflict they're not aware of that we need to bring into awareness, which takes time to work through. The other thing I would say about spirituality is there's in terms of psychotherapy, that there are a few thinkers in our field that have helped, I believe, advance our concepts of these ideas. One is Carl Rogers, who promoted what he called humanistic or person-centered therapy. And he believed that each person has within themselves what he called a self-actualizing tendency, that given the right conditions, just like any plant planted in the ground, the right kind of amount of nutrients in the soil, rain, sunlight, etc., would grow into a fruitful plant. And that his clients he saw as not necessarily having the best conditions, so he saw therapy as a way of providing them the right conditions that would help them get in touch with themselves and figure out what they needed to be. Or there's some existential approaches to therapy. You're a fan of Viktor Frankl with Man's Search for Meaning. The big approach with existential therapists is finding meaning in life, and they use a couple terms such as false self versus real self, and that a lot of people in our society tend to create this false self just to fit in and just to make things work in the here and now, and in the end end up feeling empty and meaningless inside. And so therapy for them is a form of helping you get in touch with what can make life meaningful for you. So I would say, if I'm going to be speaking as a psychotherapist here, I would say spirituality can really be a broad subject that covers a lot of what I just talked about there. Does that kind of answer your question?
So, yeah, I wanted to ask a follow-up with it real quick.
Uh-huh.
Would you say that, use the word holistic a lot, would you put holistic as interchangeable with spiritual, or would you say spiritual is a subset of holistic?
I would say spiritual would be a subset of that.
Okay. So we talked about religion in a bit, and before the show we were talking a little bit about, you were saying that there was a little bit of truth in all sorts of walks and such.
Yeah.
You said it was either a little bit of truth in all of them or no truth in any of them. Why would you put those as the only two options, and what would stop you from saying that there might be all necessary truth in one walk?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So first of all, let me back up a little bit and say that my best understanding of God as God works for people, anybody that I've known, people I've read from, my own experiences, is that the best theory that I can make for God right now is that God is a psychological construct, and I don't mean that as an insult. Okay. I would say that for many people with the experiences they've had in their lives, it's very difficult for them to see anything good within themselves. It's very difficult for them to accept, love, forgive themselves or other people. We have a couple terms in psychology called internalization and externalization. Externalization is basically anything that we can't avow within ourselves being perceived within another. And I perceive God as kind of serving that sort of function, that in a sense, each person contains within themselves the capacity to love, accept, forgive, connect, be compassionate, etc. But some people really have a hard time understanding that they can have that within themselves based on their upbringing or what have you, and that projecting that onto a concept of God and funneling that back into themselves allows them to be able to do that without being aware of it. And that's why in therapy session with a client who has that type of belief in God, I'm going to work with that because it works for them, and beating up against that is going to cause the machine to break down more than it's going to help it. Do
you see that as I'm using a useful lie, or do you see that as I'm using a thing that I personally don't ascribe to, but I'm going to ignore that question of whether or not it's true and use it?
I don't know if I'd say it either of those ways. I think I would say it as, from my understanding as a person, I see this as working within themselves whether or not they're aware of it. If they see it as that way as we're going along throughout therapy, fine. If not, fine. I don't see my role as a therapist to convince them of any perspective I have about spirituality or religion, and I find that as irrelevant in the therapy process.
Okay.
And I don't really think in those terms as a therapist. I mean, if you and I are going to be having a talk about philosophy or religion or God or whatever, I'll offer my thoughts on that. But in therapy with a client who's working with God as they understand them, I'm not really going to think about it in terms of is this literally true or not, you know? But yes, I would say that one of two positions has to be taken here in terms of religious experiences, since you asked the question that way. Because I myself, in the past, I've heard so many different types of spiritual experiences, whether they're communicating with spirits or whether they're connecting with the earth or whether they're connecting with others. There's so many different ways of being and knowing that I've gotten to learn from, that I would say if you're going to separate the religious or spiritual element from people and look at it objectively, either they're all true or they're all false. And I would hold by that. George Lucas would say they're all true.
Of course, yes.
But I would hold by that. And since you asked me, why would I hold to that? Whenever I pose this question to several different people, primarily, especially within Christianity, the response tends to be that I know mine is true and the others are false because I'm talking to God and they're talking to Satan. And to be completely honest here, that would mean that Satan has control of the majority of the planet and God doesn't, which would make Satan more powerful than God. Or that God would have deferred more to giving more power to Satan. And maybe there's a narrative construct, especially within premillennial viewpoint, that might work with that. Whatever. I don't think it works. The other perspective that I've heard a lot is I'm hearing from God, they're all insane. And again, my problem with either of these views would be, for you, that works. And so, again, if I'm going to take myself in therapy session with a client, I'm not going to get into this type of talk. It's not going to help them. Outside of that, if you're asking me for my personal views here, is if you're trying to help me as a skeptic understand your position, I'll get that from your perspective. That's valid. That's true. You're listening to Jesus, they're listening to demons. Or you're listening to God and they're insane. Fine. But if I ask the next person, they'll give me the same argument, but in the reverse about you. One person can tell me, I have a personal relationship with Jesus, and this morning he told me all gay people are going to burn in hell. And the next person will say, I have a personal relationship with Jesus, and this morning Jesus told me gay people are going to go to heaven.
And straight people are going to burn in hell.
Yes. You can add it ad nauseum, and at the end of the day, it's either you're going to say nothing of what these people have to say is valid at all, or what each person has to say is valid about their way of experiencing it. And I guess my perspective as a therapist would be each person has their own subjective experience with life, whether that's spiritual or not. And I would try to validate that in session.
All right. Yeah, I think that's all the questions I have.
King, this is the best podcast ever. I mean, it's better than the pizza I ate this morning. Don't listen to your mom. Please don't listen to your mom. She's bad. She's totally bad.
Yes. So that's...
But I'm green, I'm not orange.
Yep. So yeah, good talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we did.
Great. Yay!
So, do you have any books, if anyone would like to delve further from a layperson standpoint?
Yeah.
I'll say right away, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for
I stand behind that one totally. I can always post more on our page later if we would like to, but I was talking with Brother James about this before the podcast, and there is a fantastic article written by a psychoanalytic object relations team of therapists a few years ago called Ghosts in the Nursery, and we can always post that link. I guess we can. It talks a lot about how different parents with their kids deal with abuse from their history and why some are more likely to be abusive with their kids than others are. It's probably one of the most reader-friendly articles I've ever seen from a psychoanalytic perspective. If you're really wanting to get to know a lot of Freud's concepts, his most famous and probably best one would be Interpretation of Dreams. That's about 500 to 600 pages long and kind of dense, but it's fun. If you want to, please go to YouTube and type in Carl Rogers. He is really one of my heroes. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not, that Carl Rogers and Fred Rogers share the same last name. I would say Fred Rogers is the same thing for children as Carl Rogers is for therapists. It's all about accepting the person as they are and giving them the love that they need. So if you want to go listen to or read anything by Carl Rogers, I highly recommend it. And his stuff is not very dense, not very lingo-based at all. A few other recommendations that I'm thinking of right now. His name was Rollo May. He was an existential psychotherapist working from about the 1920s to the 1960s. So a couple of his books that I would recommend very strongly, Cry for Myth, Love and Will, or The Courage to Create.
Well, this is the Religious Nut and Hellbound Center podcast. I am the Religious Nut.
And I am the Hellbound Center. I don't know, Brother James. When do I go to hell exactly? I keep saying this, but when do I go to hell?
Not when you die. When you die, you are just kind of... We're not really sure. There are different theories on that. But it's after the judgment. After the judgment, then you will...
So is this like Chick Tracts where I stand before a faceless, bright judge?
Maybe, I guess. And then you get the demons pulling you down, and then, poked and poked and poked.
We gotta do an episode on Chick Tracts. We seriously do.
Oh, we do, yeah. Actually, we were talking about that in Sunday school today. We were making fun of them. Yeah, we were talking about ways to like reach people.
Right, yeah.
About Christ and the gospel, and we were like, the way to not do it is Chick Tracts.
Yes, yeah, I'm glad you say that. I knew you would, but yes, from an atheist perspective also, please do not do that.
But then one of the people was like, actually, I read a Chick Tract and it brought me to Christ. And he's actually a famous rocker, yeah, because he was like, I think he was touring with Led Zeppelin at the time or something, and he was at some restaurant. And he's toured with like a bunch of 80s bands and stuff. Yeah. They're interesting. Whenever I see one, I have to read it. Right.
Are you familiar with the YouTube channel The Bible Reloaded?
No.
Okay, there's two guys, Hugo and Jake, and they review both Christian movies and Chick Tracts.
Huh.
And they read them on their podcast, and they like... It's almost like MST3K, but for Chick Tracts and Christian movies.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Have you... are they Christian or no?
No, they're atheist.
Okay.
So, there'll be some things about them that you disagree with, but it's so fun though, either way. So
No, you need to read... Okay, so I am now having us sort of being promoted on a friend of mine's YouTube page, and he's got like tens of thousands of like just subscribers and followers and all and views and all that. It's called Say Goodnight Kevin.
Okay.
And have you ever heard of Nostalgia Critic?
Yes.
Those videos I showed you earlier.
Yes.
But he's like the Christian version of that, and he does it for Christian movies, and he's actually really good. Oh, I showed you that one video where he talks about the whole, LeFou is gay kind of thing.
Yes, he was great. He was awesome.
Yeah. So I'm having us promoted on that. So if anyone's listening to this,
great.
And they heard it from that, it's like, hey, cool. Yeah, he's a cool guy. You should check out some of his stuff because he just really rips into a lot of the Christian. He does God's Not Dead and God's Not Dead 2.
Okay, I'm gonna have to go watch his thoughts on those.
Oh, he rips into them. Yes, it's amazing.
Hell yeah.
This is the Religious Nut and Hellbound Center podcast. I am your Religious Nut, Brother James.
And I am the best Hellbound Center ever. Like, put extra donuts on my pizza and call me Hellbound because I will shove it up.
Okay. Hope you all have a good night or day or whatever it is.
Whenever you're listening to this. Might be 3 in the morning.
Peace.